Welcome to Watershed Chats, a solution-centric mini-series of the Water People podcast. Here, we connect with folks who are transforming social and environmental challenges through their work and play. This episode is supported by Patagonia, whose purpose-driven mission is to use business to save our home planet. I'm Lauren Hill, and my co-host is Dave Rastovich. It's estimated that we've lost 50% of Earth's coral reefs already, and if the current pace of destruction sustains, around 90% of reefs will be gone by 2050 due to ocean warming and acidification. It's a devastating prospect for the quarter of all marine life who need them to survive, and for the billion human lives dependent on the benefits of reef systems. Today's guest, Gator Halpern, co-founded VITA, which works to protect threatened reef ecosystems by growing coral up to 50 times faster, while boosting coral's resiliency against the warming and acidifying oceans that threaten their survival. Essentially, VITA farm coral on land and then replant them back onto degraded reefs, bringing them back to life. VITA recently won the first annual Earthshot Prize, awarded by the Royal Fund of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. Our podcast comes to you from the coastal land and waters of both the Bundjalung and Gubbi Gubbi nations. We'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people this podcast ripples out toward. Well, we're super excited to chat with you, and congratulations on winning the Earthshot Prize.
Thanks.
What a massive recognition.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it was a surreal experience for sure, and really proud of the whole VITA team that enabled us to get to where we're at today, and all the amazing supporters and really reef restoration practitioners around the world that made what we're doing possible.
So we know that many ecosystems, if we free them from the burden, or at least most of the burden of human impact from extraction and commercial pressures, we know that most ecosystems are resilient enough to regenerate in the absence of intensive human use. Your company, VITA, just built the world's first commercial land-based coral farm for reef restoration. In the case of coral and your work with propagating coral, why aren't marine protected areas enough to allow for reef restoration? And more broadly, what are coral reef systems telling us about the state and the fate of our world?
That's a super thoughtful question. Really appreciate how you posed it there, because we'll be the first to say at VITA that reef restoration is not the best thing we can do. The best thing possible for coral reefs is to stop killing them. And with runaway climate destabilization and the extractive industries that harm our reefs, if they keep doing that in the trajectory that we've been following in the past few decades, there's very little we'll be able to do to sustain these incredibly important ecosystems, which are collapsing all around the world. But unfortunately, we've reached a point where even if we're able to solve carbon emissions tomorrow, which obviously is not going to happen, but even if we meet all of the targets set by leaders around the world to try to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, there's still so much carbon and so much heat that is trapped in the ocean that coral reefs will continue to decline for decades to go. So reef restoration is a needed tool in the tool set to keep these ecosystems alive for generations to come. And it's in no way an excuse that can be used so that we don't have to mitigate for the damages that are causing reef degradation. We need to solve climate destabilization first and foremost. But even while we do that, we're still going to have to actively restore these ecosystems because they're at a point where we've already lost 50% of the world's reefs. By 2050, over 95% of the world's reefs are projected to die. And while we deal with climate change, we're also going to need to actively work to restore these reefs and sustain them if we're going to continue to benefit from the enormous values that these ecosystems provide.
Yeah, they're just a piece of the puzzle, and thanks for articulating that so clearly. We interviewed author Susan Casey. She's written many books, but one of our favorites in particular is called The Wave, about rogue waves in the ocean, and she spends a lot of time adventuring herself in the ocean and also writing about marine ecosystems. And she wrote that there's another world, and it's in this one, in reference to the parallel universe that the ocean is, where we've only mapped about 20% of the seabed. And I think the popular adage goes that we know more about the moon than the oceans of our own biosphere. I'm wondering, did you have a personal moment of recognition about this other world that made you want to focus your life and livelihood on restoring the state of the oceans?
So that's a beautiful way to put it by Miss Casey. And I definitely resonate with that feeling and that emotion of wonder and amazement when I enter into the ocean and see the absolute magic that exists, particularly in my case in coral reef ecosystems, where you can go scuba diving and see things that are, more brilliant and beautiful than ever could exist in a space, kind of fantasy world right here on Earth. And it's real, it's alive, it's
psychedelic. It's absolutely psychedelic.
Better than Dr. Seuss could ever draw.
Yeah.
And so I'm constantly amazed by how amazing and beautiful the oceans are and our natural ecosystems that we have all around the world. There were a few kind of aha moments, if you will, in my life that led me to this kind of career path and devoting myself to trying to make as much impact as I can for the fate of our oceans and world in general, which are so, closely intertwined. It dates back from my childhood growing up in San Diego, California, and spending as much time as I could on the beach and in the waves and just really experiencing and loving nature, which I think is the key first step that everyone needs to take if we're going to have the kind of individual changes necessary to solve the situation we're in, is really just having that experience and understanding and knowledge of the world around you. And then as I grew up, I became an environmental scientist and did a bunch of research projects, was able to see incredible corners of the world, from the Andes to the Amazon to South Africa and Brazil, doing different environmental research projects. But really my love for coral reefs began as I started scuba diving and had those experiences where I could see, a house-sized coral that was tens of thousands of years old, this giant gumdrop shape with giant clams infused in it, thousands of brilliantly colored fish swimming in and out, and just witnessing the magnitude and intricate beauty of those organisms, and then seeing at the same time how quickly those reefs are changing around us. They're really the first global ecosystem that we're seeing collapse due to climate change. They're really the canaries in the coal mine, if you will. And after having those experiences and understanding the situation going on and the pace of reef decline, it was clear that, I wanted to do anything I could to try to make a difference.
That's great that you took it upon yourself to transform that personal experience into action. That's definitely a calling that so many of us are going to have to heed in the coming years. You spoke for a moment of the intricate beauty of reef systems. I was just reading a bit of this book that I have here, Ian McCalman's book, The Reef, A Passionate History. And I was struck by the way that studying coral reef reproduction has helped us to understand a deeper complexity of how the living world behaves rather than Darwin's more simplistic branching tree model of natural selection. Corals and many plants seem to create what scientists have termed reticulate evolution. I was wondering if you could speak to some of the incredible complexity that you've encountered in coral lives and behavior.
Yeah, well, you hit on a key one, being the spawning of corals, and partaking in the annual coral spawning event, which we do every year here at Coral VITA, is a exhilarating and exhausting and incredible experience, which has taught us, as you said, a lot about life on Earth because of the incredible magical nature of it, that we still have so much to learn about, really, because corals spawn in a way that we scientists have no real understanding of how they're able to coordinate it, because you'll be out on a reef and across an entire island, or hundreds of miles of reef, all the corals of a certain species will somehow know to release their eggs and sperm at the exact same time, because the sperm are only viable for so long, and you have to release them into the water column with enough time frame so it gets moved around by the waves and the currents to connect by chance with an egg of another coral of the same species. And so they give off these eggs and sperm in a spawning event, which happens in the middle of the night after the full moon in the hottest month of the year. But it can be anywhere from 2 days to 10 days after the full moon, and no one really knows when it's going to happen. So you basically have to be out there all night scuba diving for hours, watching these corals and waiting night after night until you're lucky enough to actually experience the coral spawn, which is the biggest party buffet that exists on the reefs, and one of the biggest parties you can go to in the world, with the entire reef coming alive. Every single animal is out trying to eat up some eggs and swimming around eating the other animals that are eating the eggs, and it's this cacophony on the reef. It's actually super loud, even underwater, of all the marine life that's out during the coral spawn, which typically only happens once a year. And so at Coral VITA, we go out and wait for this moment to happen. And once it's there, occasionally I've been lucky enough to be able to just watch and take pictures and experience the phosphorescence and beauty of what's going on. But typically it's a work night, and we're there trying to collect as much sperm and eggs as we can to bring back to our coral farm, and then we can crossbreed the
what does that look like? Are you with little nets
exactly.
or jars or what?
You're waiting there all night with a little flashlight, but not trying to use the flashlight much, because the coral are somewhat affected by the light. That's one of the ways they know when it's time to reproduce. And so when it actually starts happening, you throw a net, just like you said, over the top of the coral, and the base of the net is weighted, but the top floats, and it funnels all the packets of eggs and sperm up into a funnel that has a test tube at the top. So we have test tubes at the top filling up with these egg packets, and we do that to 5, 6, 10 different corals across the reef, all at the same time. Fill up as many test tubes from different genotypes as possible, and then rush back to the boat, hop on the boat, and zoom back to the lab where we mix the different eggs and sperm together from the different colonies of coral. And then in our lab, the real hard work starts, as we basically have to do diaper changes to these baby coral for the next week or two, depending on the species, as they metamorphosize from single eggs to larvae to eventually settling and becoming a coral polyp. And out in nature, the rule of thumb is that a coral will have to give off 1 million eggs before it successfully creates an offspring.
Wow.
In our lab, we've gotten that down closer to about every 1,000 eggs we collect, we can create a new coral offspring. So we're trying to remove that huge bottleneck that exists in the reproductive phase and help as many new genetically unique coral colonies that we can help settle and put back into the reef to increase the diversity and the number of corals out on the reef here.
Wow. And so when sperm and eggs are in the process of communicating for the first time, are the sperm and egg species specific, or does any egg have the potential of fertilizing with any sperm?
They are species specific. So, the egg of an elkhorn coral will have to meet the sperm of a different elkhorn coral. And the chances out in nature that it actually happens with all the marine life trying to eat it and the, waves and currents and stuff are pretty low. And that's why, it takes 1 million eggs before you get lucky enough to have one successful offspring.
Wow. And you all with Coral VITA have managed to expedite the process of coral growth 50 times. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's another thing we do. So we create these land-based coral farms, which are basically aquaculture facilities with tanks that we pump water through and grow our coral in. And that type of you could call it high-tech coral farming allows us to do some really exciting things to break down some of the barriers to large-scale ecosystem restoration, one of which is actually accelerating the coral growth rates by, as you say, up to 50 times how fast they grow in nature. We do that through a process called microfragmentation. So I'll try not to get too sciencey on you, but going to kind of Coral 101, if you see a coral, you think, oh, that's one coral, but really a coral is a colony. It's made up of hundreds or thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of individual animals that grow together into a coral colony. Each animal is called a polyp. And at our farm, we can actually break those corals apart into tiny pieces, and they'll naturally heal back together, fuse back together with their same parent colony. So through the process of microfragmentation, we can break them apart, fuse them together, break them apart, fuse them together, and keep the corals in constant horizontal lateral growth mode. So they're growing tissue all the time, rather than when they're growing in nature, they spend most of their time and energy growing the skeleton that they sit on top of. So they actually grow limestone as a skeleton and create the reefs, which create all the 3D shapes that form our reefs and actually form the entire country of the Bahamas that I'm living in now. Only exists because the rock we build our homes on was ancient coral skeleton.
How did you end up in the Bahamas?
So I founded Coral VITA with my good friend from grad school, Sam Teicher. It was kind of a back porch idea of how we could try to make a difference in this issue that we both care so deeply about. And we were incredibly fortunate to be in the position we were with the support networks that allowed us to pursue this dream and work towards creating a coral farm like we have now. And it took us a long time before we put all the pieces together to get here to the Bahamas. There was a lot of business planning, fundraising, connecting with research institutes, and these techniques I'm talking about have been developed by research institutes around the world. So going there, learning who's doing the best science, the most cutting edge, game changing science, and building partnerships with different organizations from Florida to Hawaii to Australia. And after we got the foundation ready, the business plan had the model and the funding, we ended up looking around the Caribbean at a few different locations for where to build our first farm, and eventually ended up here in Freeport, Grand Bahama, largely due to a partnership we built with the Grand Bahama Port Authority, who have supported us from the beginning with the ability to build our farm on some of their land, as well as access to a streamlined permitting process and the like. So through that partnership, we ended up here in the Bahamas and have really been welcomed with open arms into the Bahamian community, and we're incredibly grateful for the friendships and community that we have here in the Bahamas.
They must have a tremendous sense of the economic value of coral reefs, and so have invested in the future of the reefs by partnering with you all. I'd love for you to speak to what it is that we lose when we lose coral reefs, when we face the prospective future of losing 90% of coral reef systems on the planet.
Yeah, it's really tough to over-exaggerate the importance of these ecosystems. Coral reefs are really cornerstones of life in the ocean and therefore life on the entire planet. Despite covering less than 1% of the ocean floor, coral reefs are home to over a quarter of all marine species. So they're the most biodiverse habitat on the planet. And as we lose our coral reefs, we lose all of the incredible diversity of life that lives on those reefs. So from my perspective and why I got into this in the first place, the loss of coral reefs is one of the greatest ecological tragedies that I could even think of. But why Coral VITA works as a mission-driven company is because it's also a serious socioeconomic issue, because coral reefs are vital ecosystems that sustain the livelihoods of up to 1 billion people all around the world. They're incredibly valuable through 3 main ways. The first is ecotourism. So here in the Bahamas, there's a lot of tourism that's reef-based, but then even more so through fisheries production, because all those species I was talking about earlier, many of the fish stocks that we like to eat and fish and see around the tropics depend upon coral reefs for part or all of their life cycle. And then lastly, one that we experienced firsthand here in Grand Bahama and the community here knows really well, coral reefs, they're called a barrier reef for a reason. They are the barrier that our coastlines have between the open ocean and the beach. And so coral reefs are natural shoreline protection from storm surges and waves. And without these coral reefs, we have more erosion of coastlines, but also far more damage in hurricanes and storm events. So they're vital living infrastructure, without which many communities around the world wouldn't be able to survive.
And you all faced the wrath of that experience in setting up your farm not long ago, didn't you?
Yeah. So in September 2019, so a bit over 2 years ago, we were hit by Hurricane Dorian, which was the most powerful hurricane ever recorded in the Caribbean. And the island of Grand Bahama was one of the most heavily hit. We had 220 mile an hour winds, which weren't the real issue. The serious damage came from a 21-foot, so a 7-meter storm surge that passed over the island and flooded a large portion of the island, including a lot of communities as well as our coral farm. So the farm was completely underwater. We ended up in the weeks following finding our coral tanks washed ashore 35 miles east of where our farm's located. Wow. But in the aftermath, we transitioned into doing humanitarian work and everything from search and rescue to aid delivery to a bit of rebuilding. What became clear throughout that time and throughout the tragic experience of seeing the fishing villages and communities that were hit hardest by the storm. When we talk to these Bahamians, they would often point to the ecosystems around them, the mangroves and the coral reefs offshore, as what really kept them alive. And we could see how these natural ecosystems, the living infrastructure that surrounds us here in the Bahamas, is the best defense that we have against the increasing and intensifying storms that are coming our way. And so through that experience, it only deepened our passion and desire for the work of reef restoration. And luckily we've been able to rebuild our farm, not only like it was before, but to expand the farm and make it even more high tech so that we can do the most impactful restoration possible here in the Bahamas over the years ahead. And in the future, we want to take these methods all around the world and create a global network of large land-based coral farms that can really sustain a significant portion of reef despite all the threats they face.
What a learning curve after the storm to have to grow the business in unexpected ways and plug into the community in unexpected ways. But it seems like you all had the resiliency to dive in and maximize the opportunity and make lemonade out of what was definitely a tragic and devastating experience. So we're surfers and we spend our lives obsessed by waves, and we've spent a lot of our careers traveling to quieter corners of the world, and we've spent a fair amount of time on coral reefs and around coral reefs. And I'm originally from Florida, so I've spent a fair bit of time in the Bahamas and some of the islands in the Caribbean there, and it's just such a treasure, such a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. There has been a lot of movement in recent years in trying to create artificial waves from structures planted under the ocean surface. I'm interested if you all have been engaged with the idea of creating waves based on human constructed reef systems.
I would love to. As I said, I grew up in San Diego and spent a good amount of time in the waves as well. One of the things I lament about the island I live on, the Bahamas, is the reefs are beautiful. We do a lot of free diving and, kiteboarding and the like, but no waves here in Grand Bahama, unfortunately. I would love to dream about building a reef that could create waves, and we've thought a good deal about artificial reef structures that are being created and how we can actually dovetail with the organizations that build artificial reefs or seawalls and breakwaters and actually bring them to life with real coral. So instead of having a concrete, reef that you make for a wave, you can actually build it in a way that we can plant coral all over that seawall, that breakwater, and actually create a living seawall, bring that to life, and have all the myriad of benefits you can have from a thriving ecosystem rather than just a man-made structure. And the wave making world is a very interesting one, and I don't know that people have nailed the engineering and the design enough yet to be able to incorporate, living creatures on top of it as well. They're still trying to figure out how to create the good barrel out of just a man-made structure. But for any of those wave creators out there, if they want to collaborate and try to bring their wave structures to life with coral reefs, we'd love to get involved.
Cool. From what we can tell, there are around 6,000 species of coral that we know of across both shallow and deep marine environments. Your farm grows about 12 types of coral at this point. Is that right?
We used to have 24 before Dorian. We're getting back up there. But yeah, there's been a bad disease outbreak too, a whole nother story. That's why we downgraded the number of species we're growing at the moment.
modern agriculture hasn't shown the best track record on land in terms of scaling up, in terms of diversity. And I was wondering, is there any danger of creating monoculture in the oceans if we aren't able to scale up with a greater diversity of species of coral?
It's a great question, and one we think a lot about. So at our coral farm, before Hurricane Dorian, we're growing 24 species of coral. Hopefully we'll be back to that number soon, which in comparison to most reef restoration projects around the Caribbean, most are growing 2, 3, sometimes 4 or 5 species of coral. So we're trying to expand upon that greatly, and we're trying to incorporate as many different species as we can into a holistic restoration practice. The actual numbers of coral species are surprisingly low here in the Caribbean, actually. Most of the coral species that you find are in the Pacific and South Pacific, where they have a much wider diversity of coral species. In the Caribbean basin, we actually only have somewhere around 50 or 60 species of coral. And so if we can get back to where we were before the hurricane, we'd already be growing half of the species of coral that exist here on the reefs. And through our land-based methods, we're actually able to open up a much wider diversity of corals because of the accelerated growth rates. A lot of corals take a long time to grow, and so it's tough to use them in a restoration practice. But by accelerating the growth rates, we're able to grow, a dinner plate sized coral in a matter of months rather than a matter of decades, which allows us to grow a diversity of corals that can really do fairly holistic restoration on the reef.
That's incredible. And how are you choosing which species you focus on? Are you self-selecting heat-resistant, climate-tolerant species above others that may be less so?
Great question. Yeah. So we do a process called assisted evolution that was pioneered by some of our advisors at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. And with that method, we're able to actually increase the resilience of corals across the entire range of species. So we're not selecting any one species that we think is going to do best in the warmest environments. We're taking the array of coral species that we can, and we're trying to increase the resilience within each of those species. And we do that by acclimating the corals to warmer conditions. So basically in our tanks, we can crank up the heat, crank up the acidity, and mimic what future oceans are projected to be in 2050 or 2100, and then cool the corals back down, heat them up, cool them back down, kind of like taking them to the gym. They're able to build up some tolerance against the hotter and more acidic oceans that do threaten their survival. But then we're also able to see which individuals within a species naturally are more resilient against those conditions. And so not all corals are created equal. They have different genes, and some survive better than others in warm events. And so we can, through those processes, see which individual corals we want to select to actually seed our next batch of corals and to breed together to try to create the most hardy, resilient corals possible that have the best chance of surviving the oceans of the future.
That's so great to hear. It sounds like a very humble approach. I guess our recent past has shown us as a species to be quite heavy-handed and top-down, kind of dominating when it comes to thinking that we understand and we know how ecosystems work. So it's cool to hear you all moving forward with an openness to the way that life is able to shift and adapt in ways that maybe are unexpected.
Yeah, there's no way we could do this better than Mother Nature can do herself. And the magic that exists in life on the reefs and life on our world is something that I think humans are a far, far way away from being able to grasp and even understand. And so really the best thing we're doing at Coral Vita is to try to give nature a hand and assist in the natural processes that are occurring and try to amplify the ability that the reef has to restore itself.
We learned about your work not long ago with the announcement of the Earthshot Prize winners. If you're listening and you haven't heard of it yet, the Earthshot Prize is a new global prize for the environment designed to incentivize change and help to repair our planet over the next 10 years. It's currently funded by the Royal Foundation of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, and they award 5 £1 million prizes each year. And they've committed to do that for the next 10 years, providing at least 50 solutions to the world's greatest environmental problems by 2030. Coral Vita just found out that you've won this prize. I'm interested to know how this win will shape your work over the next year or more.
I mean, winning the Earthshot Prize was an incredible honor and is recognition for all the hard work that the Coral Vita team has put in, but is also really recognition for the coral reef restoration and coral science community that has brought us here to this moment where we can make a difference and we can keep reefs alive despite all the stresses and threats that they have. And so really we see this award as one that we can share with the rest of the coral community that has really enabled us to do the work we're doing. And we hope to use the award to really elevate the space of reef restoration in general and to scale our work with different partner organizations who are already working on reefs all around the world and try to create the most scientifically based and impactful restoration projects that we can in different geographies, and also to deepen our impact here in the Bahamas, but really to create a global network that needs to exist in order to solve this issue and to disseminate the best practices that different organizations have around the world in order to make the impact that we can in reefs wherever they're needed.
So this conversation will air as part of our Watershed Chat series, which is all about people who are working and playing to pursue solutions to social and environmental challenges. We speak to a lot of people who have NGOs and who are struggling financially. They have tiny operations who are trying to do good work with relatively few resources. I'm interested to know why you chose to structure Coral Vita as a for-profit company instead of an NGO.
So we thought long and hard about how we wanted to structure Coral Vita. And as we were in the initial stages of the company, we felt that the amount of impact we would be able to create for coral reefs would be far greater if we can galvanize a industry around reef restoration and around reef health conservation, because there's incredible work being done by nonprofit organizations all around the world that have really formed the foundation of reef restoration and of the environmental movement in general in many different categories. But unfortunately, when you think about the scale of these issues, the nonprofit way of addressing issues doesn't seem like it's going to be able to cut it when we're talking about the billions and billions of dollars that we need to annually spend on reef restoration, for instance. And this could be analogous to a bunch of different environmental and social causes. And so Sam and I decided with Coral Vita, we were going to address the issue from a different direction. And instead of trying to get grants and fellowships and, corporate social responsibility funding, we're trying to create an industry where there is a marketplace that provides the value of coral reefs, sustaining coral reefs, and going to the stakeholders that benefit hugely from having these reefs alive and creating a marketplace where we can go to those stakeholders and say, you're benefiting from this reef through X, Y, and Z ways, but the reef's dying and you're no longer going to be able to derive that value unless you take these steps in order to conserve the reef, protect the reef, and restore the reef. And so trying to shift the relatively resource scarce space of, nonprofit work that is centered around reef restoration towards what we think can be a resource abundant marketplace where organizations, companies, international development agencies, governments, industries can all invest in doing restoration work and creating a restoration economy. And we think that that's really the only way we're going to be able to reach the scale necessary to make the impact we need to on these global issues.
Have those stakeholders that you spoke about, government agencies, for example, have they been receptive to investing in reef restoration? It seems like government has been slow to adapt ecological restoration in general. How has the experience been for you?
Government's always slow to adapt, I guess. But the tide does seem to be turning on that. And there's a lot of momentum that is being gained in this space of the restoration economy and in creating living infrastructure. Because we're starting to have conversations around a coral reef, not only as some shared common resource, but really as necessary living infrastructure that provides very tangible and clear benefits and values for different stakeholders. And there's a bit of a education curve that needs to happen with many stakeholders, but the conversations are getting easier and easier to have, and people now have a deeper understanding, I feel, of the situation going on with coral reefs and why that's important, why we need to do something about it. And we're actually able to announce our first restoration contract with the Bahamian government, which we took as a amazing sign of a long partnership to come, as even in the age of the pandemic and after being hit by one of the most powerful hurricanes ever in Hurricane Dorian, a government like the Bahamas was still able to see the value in paying for reef restoration and starting down the journey of sustaining these reefs because of the clear values that they provide.
What is your most optimistic projection of the state of coral reefs 10 years from now? What will Coral VITA have achieved by then if the doom and gloom projections don't come to fruition? Yeah,
I'll try to keep it as rosy but also realistic as I can here, because 10 years isn't too long. So I think we'll still be deep in the trenches in terms of doing our work to restore reefs in 10 years. But on an optimistic note, I think the awareness that is being created around the world right now with climate destabilization and coral reefs in particular, there is all the opportunity in the world to see a future where people are investing heavily in sustaining reefs, and we're creating community-based projects as well as large-scale coral farms that are able to grow millions of corals all around the world and be able to actively restore those reefs while taking away the stressors that are killing them in the first place. So, as I said before, the best thing we can do for reefs is to stop killing them. And I think the number one best outcome that could exist for coral reefs in 10 years is actually significant climate action to be taken by our governments and corporate leaders around the world so that we can get a handle on things and we don't have to deal with runaway global warming. So that first and foremost is the optimistic thing. I think we can do that around the world. We need to hold our politicians and corporations accountable for what they're doing. And people around the world know that this is an issue. All we have to do is stand up and hold the politicians accountable. So if we can do that, we'll be here deep in the trenches at Coral VITA and different restoration organizations all around the world, building up the infrastructure necessary to keep these reefs alive in decades to come.
That's so great. How can folks get involved and or support your work?
Please check us out on Coral VITA Reefs on all the media platforms and follow along on our story. If you'd like, you can adopt a coral and we'll actually send you updates on its growth in our farm and outplanting onto the reef. And then hopefully you can come visit us here in the Bahamas, or hopefully soon we'll be closer to all your listeners wherever they are around the world. But you can come see our farm, learn about what we're doing, and one day hopefully plant a coral with us.
Great. Oh, thanks so much for your time today, Gator. And yeah, congratulations on the Earthshot Prize. And thank you so much on behalf of water people all around the world for helping to take care of these precious ecosystems.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate all that you're doing to spread the good word and love all around different corners of the ocean.
Special thanks to Patagonia for making this episode possible. They're a certified B Corporation and founding member of 1% for the Planet. Many thanks to our sound engineer and editor, Shannon Soul Carroll. The podcast soundtracks are also composed by Shannon. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my co-host, Dave Rastovich, thanks for listening with us today. We'll be continuing the conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast.